Welcome to THA Talks, for free thought and open minds. Hello, I'm Paul Wellstone and you're listening to edition 64 of THA Talks, the alternative podcast show from the UK, bringing you weekly shows and all the best interviews we can get our sticky mitts on. If you'd like to check out our full archive, just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. Our talks include news, conspiracies, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion, and much more. For anyone who'd like to contact us and give us some feedback or recommend a guest for the show, you can email us at info@thatalks.com, or you can go to our website and follow the contact link there. And don't forget, you can subscribe to our show via our RSS feed, and you can also find us on iTunes and Stitcher and many other podcast directories out there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in again, and it's good to be back. It's still a bit cold here in the UK, and it actually has been snowing a little bit, which is a bit of a problem for us here in the UK because we do get a bit flustered when the weather starts to change. We have just had In Bulk passers by, and for those of you who don't know, In Bulk is a pagan festival. It's basically a sign that the sun is just starting to creep back. You might start to notice that the days now just starting to get a little bit lighter, and just small signs that sun of ours is starting to creep back closer to us. And we can all be a bit more optimistic. Of course, in the olden days, there was great reason to be optimistic because they didn't have as much to get them through the winter as we do today. So it was a very optimistic sign for those of our ancestors in the past who had been waiting all through the winter to see those signs of that precious sun coming back. Anyway, moving on. Not all our listeners are probably as cold as we are here in the UK and perhaps a few other places out there, particularly people in America. I bet you most of you out there are a bit more toasty than I am out here at the moment. I'm just going to give a bit of a shout out to some of our listeners, where you're all at. We've had a lot of downloads from United States at the moment, so thumbs up to America. Thank you for your support. Great to have you checking us out. Of course, the United Kingdom, the old faithful there, you are doing us proud, thank you. Also, a lot of downloads from Canada, Australia, Brazil, Ireland, Netherlands, Germany, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Japan, New Zealand, Thailand, India, Romania, Portugal, France, Switzerland, Israel, Philippines, Spain, Austria, Argentina, Belgium, Croatia, Denmark, Malaysia, Turkey, Italy, Hungary, Azerbaijan, Korea, Hong Kong, Serbia, Poland, El Salvador, Estonia, Costa Rica, China, Greece, South Africa, Ukraine, Ecuador, Russia, Iceland, Indonesia, and Mexico. So I'd like to give you all a big thank you for listening to the show, and just to basically point out, that alternative media, it's cool. It's a good way of getting stuff out there. Even a little show like this, our little community is reaching out there, touching people around the globe. Right now, who's listening to this on the other side of the world? Who knows? But I just wanted to let you guys know where our listeners are and how we're doing like that. Not only is it interesting, but I just think it's pretty cool, and just wanted to give you all a thumbs up. Anyway, let's move on, not to the other side of the world, but this time to the other side of London, where there's often a surge and there's often a dramaturge. And he's often called David Parry.
Good evening, Mr. Obertelli. How are you?
I'm good. And how are you?
Well, you notice I don't have a song or a poem today.
Ah, yes. Do tell.
And I will explain that. We've been having fun on Facebook, particularly me, over the last couple of days. After our last show, which I felt was quite a triumph in many ways. I mean, Jack Wolfe is a remarkable writer, and I think he's a very prominent heathen. But some heathens on Facebook took great exception to people of mixed blood even being involved in heathenry. So much for free thoughts and open minds, I feel. So I've been deleted from a couple of groups, and told that we have a childish show and they don't want to listen to it. Thank God.
Well, there you go. Well, basically, I mean, I don't know what to say. That just sounds very childish from their point of view, really.
Well, I mean, let me address a few points. We have fun on this show. We are not pretending to be academics like some podcasts. Why? Because we have real access to proper academicians and those circles. Therefore, we wouldn't insult them. Secondly, we are part of a theatre company. And, we don't believe in showing a Poe face to the world. We believe in celebrating the world in all of its richness and complexity in a number of ways. Apart from that, I don't care. This is a serious podcast. We do what we want to do our way, and it's a pleasure working with you, Paul, doing it just the way we do.
And right back at you, David. I mean, the thing is, people forget, when you got a show like this, it's interesting to get all points of view. That means that you might interview someone where you completely don't agree with, but it's still interesting to hear their perspective. A lot of people think if you post a show up on Facebook, you're promoting that ideology or that claim or something. No, you're promoting the show. It's up to you to listen to it and to make your own mind up. We're not here to brainwash you like a lot of other sources. We're here to present material to you so you can listen to it and make of it what you like. So if you've deleted David from your page because he's posting stuff that's somehow attacking your ego or your reality system that you obviously can't handle yourself, then you need to listen to podcasts that are very defined down to much more narrow spectrum of information and what's around us, and you probably won't learn much. So that's what I think of that.
Well, I mean, it's like reading a book, isn't it? You don't have to agree with the book, but it's worth reading. And secondly, yes, we have been accused of self-promotion. Hey, what do you think? So, I mean, I must admit, at first I thought my nose was out of joint, but actually it's not.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got a show here. Of course we're promoting it. What would be the point if we kept it a secret? Anyway.
Well, Paul, since there are so many conspiracies surrounding us at the minute, what conspiracy do we have on tonight?
Okay, well, this evening's guest is going to be Professor James Fetzer, who is a philosopher of science who has spent over 35 years working on assessing and clarifying the forms and foundations of scientific explanation, probability of science, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of cognitive science, particularly in artificial intelligence and computer science. He has published over 100 articles and 20 books. In the early 1990s, Fetzer began researching and publicly addressing the John F. Kennedy assassination, then later the 9/11 attacks, and also research regarding the 2002 death of Senator Paul Wellstone. He confounded scholars for 9/11 Truth in 2005 and claims that the United States government and the Israeli government are involved in these and other conspiracies. His allegations have led to several live television appearances on mainstream news channels where he's been locking his horns and defending his views. Today he continues to research unfolding events with suspicion, and he's making his voice heard.
Well, I mean, he's obviously a very interesting man, isn't he? I mean, the point, the facet that caught my interest was his background in the philosophy of science. But I suspect this is more of a Paul Obertelli show than a David show, if I'm completely honest.
Oh, yes. Well, a lot of the conspiracies he touches on. I haven't actually researched a lot of what he goes into. I mean, I know the general gist of what it is, so I'm going to be learning more about Professor Fetzer myself today, so I've been really looking forward to it. But from 9/11, I mean, he went on news channels of 9/11 and the thing is, I've never ever seen a mainstream news channel give anyone credit or respect for anything that they say against the system, against the government, against whatever it is. They've never supported it. So that to me says everything.
Paul, I mean, you know where I stand. I think our listeners know where I stand. I'm sympathetic to certain conspiracy theories. Some of them I just find absolutely bewildering. But, if a gentleman like this is saying these things, it's definitely worth at least a hearing.
Absolutely. Well, I think there are a lot of conspiracies out where people take it and run once they see that, but only because once they see something's possible, when they see a conspiracy, they think, God damn, they did that, that's possible, then they take and run with everything. Then all of a sudden, every single thing's a conspiracy and it's possible. But obviously, you've got to research and do it. And I get the impression Professor James Fetzer does his research. So let's get to it. Professor Jim Fetzer, welcome to THA Talks.
Oh, I'm pleased to be here. Delighted.
Yeah, it's a subject we've wanted to cover, and we kind of threw a message out to our listeners to see if they can think of any ideas, and here you are now, so we're really pleased about that. I've also looked around on YouTube to check out some videos, and I've seen you being confronted by the mainstream news who are attacking your views in certain events and making out that you're crazy and so on. But I mean, given you're a respected guy with very good credentials, what kind of inspired you to stick your neck out and challenge them like that? What got you all into this?
Well, I'd become involved in JFK research where I organized a group of a research team of the best qualified individuals to ever study the case back in 1992. And we wound up, we discovered almost immediately that the JFK autopsy x-rays had been altered to conceal a massive blowout at the back of the head, that another person's brain had been substituted for that of JFK, since once you patched the blowout, there was nowhere for all that brains to go, and that there were multiple indications that the home movies of the assassination had been altered. And indeed, all of our work has been massively confirmed in spades. In fact, we know today that the limousine was brought to a halt in Dealey Plaza after bullets began to be fired, that JFK was hit twice during that interval. Once in the back of the head, he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up, and he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that set up shockwaves that blew his brain out to the left rear with such force that when they impacted with Officer Bobby Hargis riding there, he initially thought he himself had been shot. We know now, based upon research by Larry Rivera on interviews that Fred Newcomb, who was an early student of the case, had done with the motorcycle escort officers, that Officer Hargis actually parked his bike, got off, and ran between the two limousines to head toward the grassy knoll, the picket fence from which he believed shots had been fired. That Officer Jackson on the right side actually motored his vehicle up the grassy knoll until it fell over, and also continued toward the picket fence and the grassy knoll. And that 5 agents disembarked from the Queen Mary, the Secret Service Cadillac, and surrounded the presidential limousine. One of them taking a chunk of JFK's skull from a little boy who had picked it up and throwing it in the back seat. Meanwhile, Clint Hill had clambered on the back of the trunk, pushed Jackie back into the seat, and was lying across their bodies, where he observed this fist-sized hole in the back of JFK's head. He gave a thumbs down to all of his colleagues. This was all during what has to have been a rather substantial interval. I'm guessing now it may have been anywhere from 20 to even 30 seconds. We had a host of witnesses who reported seeing the limousine either slow dramatically or come to a complete stop. And we have about a half a dozen who've seen what they refer to as the other film, which seems to be an unedited version, who had confirmed the 2 hits to the head. But these interviews with the motorcycle escort officers have been fantastic in confirming what actually happened there. It's a spectacular story. And of course, it implicates the government in covering up the assassination, which appears to have been provoked, really spearheaded by Lyndon Johnson himself, who even sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. Okay. And once, to get more to your answer, I published those before my 3 books on JFK, bringing together experts in different areas. One in 1998, Assassination Sign, another in Murder in Dealey Plaza, 2000, a third, The Great Zapruder Film Hoax, in 2003. But while I was on the campus, the Duluth campus of the University of Minnesota, in 2002, Senator Paul Wellstone, who was really quite a courageous and heroic figure, died in a very odd plane crash that occurred only 60 miles north of where I was situated. And I began investigating his death, which turned out to be no accident at all, but where it was startling for me to discover that the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, cannot investigate non-accident compatible hypotheses or explanations. In this case, that would be the plane, the pilots, and the weather, unless they have the concurrence of the Attorney General, who declares it to be a crime scene, in which case they can explore other alternatives, such as a small bomb, a gas canister, some kind of high-tech weapon. What this means is that the NTSB never actually investigated whether he could have been taken out by an assassination, where I published 10 articles in an alternative newspaper in Duluth and a book, a co-authored book with Don Four-Arrows Jacobs entitled American Assassination in 2004, which we announced at the National Press Club 2 years to the day of his death. And I think that just hooked, so that when I retired in 2006, I became a conspiracy analyst. I have been doing practically full-time work. My wife tells me I'm busier in retirement than I was when I was teaching full-time. And I've been doing all this research, more on JFK, a whole lot on 9/11. I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December of 2005, just 6 months before my retirement. But I have since organized its first national conference in Madison in 2007, its first international conference in London in 2010, its second international conference in Vancouver in 2012. And I've just expanded from that to Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Charlie Hebdo, and a host of others, including, of course, this absurdity in Buenos Aires, where the Zionists are trying to pin the tail on Christina Kirchner, the president, for an offense they themselves committed. I mean, this is a classic false flag attacks in Argentina in 1992 and 1994, which we can go into in some detail if you like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, regarding the Kennedy assassination, I mean, I wasn't around back then, so that was, for me, I'm kind of just looking at the research after. But for me, 9/11 was the first conspiracy that kind of blew up in my face. You know, I was basically, I was sucked in a little bit at first, and then after a short while, I'm thinking, hang on, something's really not adding up here, and you kind of just wake up to it. And then, of course, every conspiracy, everything that's unfolding, you want to check it out and study it a bit more, and you're just more suspicious about things. Do you see that collectively all these conspiracies, are they all from the same people? Are they all from the same source and agenda, or are we just living in a very corrupt place?
Well, I do think there is a core, and that the CIA, unfortunately, is very much behind a lot of this. I mean, and the CIA was a principal player in JFK. I've identified 6 shooters, 3 of whom had ties to JFK, none of whom was Lee Oswald. It was sponsored by powerful special interests, including the agency, which JFK was threatening to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs were upset with him because he had not invaded Cuba, contrary to their unanimous recommendation. He'd gone ahead and signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union against their unanimous opposition, and now he was pulling our forces out of Vietnam, where they believed a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. The mafia was upset because Bobby was cracking down on organized crime, bringing more indictments and convictions than ever before in American history. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed was upset because JFK had directed the Department of the Treasury to print hundreds of millions of United States notes in the belief that it was absurd for the government to be paying interest to a consortium of private banks for printing the currency of the United States. And where the Texas oil men were very upset because he was planning to cut the oil depletion allowance, there were other groups, not last or least being Israel, because JFK was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, one of its principal founders and its first prime minister, over the development of nuclear weapons by Israel, which JFK opposed, but Ben-Gurion wanted. And in fact, JFK believed that the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, ought to be registered as a foreign agent. I think that was very far-sighted on his part. And if the measures that he had planned for this country had been implemented, we'd be living in a different world today.
Okay, I mean, looking around today, there's so much going on at the moment. I mean, we can touch on so many things this evening. Maybe if we take a look at what's going on with ISIS in the Middle East at the moment, and all these beheadings and attacks and horrific things we're being shown through the mainstream. Do you think there's any substance to that, or do you regard that as a conspiracy as well? Is that all that stuff really going on? Or
well,
to what extent?
I think you have to go back to 9/11, which was used as the rationale for getting the United States involved in these wars in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. I mean, it was Benjamin Netanyahu who had a conference, as I recall, in Jerusalem in 1979, would subsequently publish a book in 1987 about terrorism, how the West can win before the concept was in anyone's mind whatsoever. With the demise of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, the military-industrial complex needed a new boogeyman to justify the massive expenditures. We never experienced a peace dividend. What could be better than a shadowy terrorist force that doesn't even have any geographical boundaries? So that if you need, to have a terrorist event to affect public opinion in the United States and support policies that might otherwise not be received with enthusiasm, you can arrange an attack and claim it was performed by Al-Qaeda or whomever. And who's in the position to say that's wrong? I mean, anyone who has looked into 9/11 realizes that it was brought to us by the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense and the Mossad, that there were Zionists in the New York Port Authority who were responsible for the transfer to Larry Silverstein private hands just 6 weeks before 9/11. He fired the security firm that had been looking after the World Trade Center since it opened in 1970, hired Kroll, which was an Israeli firm, got a new insurance policy with a terrorist clause so that if he were actually, had a terrorist attack, he could have coverage. And because there were allegedly two planes, he claimed double indemnity and collected somewhere between $4.5 to $7 billion on a $114 million investment. The buildings, the Twin Towers, were in very bad shape. They were loaded with asbestos. There had been a directive issued by the Port Authority that asbestos had to be removed. It couldn't be done by a classic controlled demolition because that would release all the asbestos particles into the air. And erecting scaffolds over 110-story buildings would have been prohibitively expensive. Very convenient to have them taken out in a terrorist attack that released all these toxic elements, including heavy metals, computer components, and the like, into the atmosphere. In fact, we have studies now conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey of the dust samples from all over New York that showed a whole host of elements, including barium and strontium and uranium and lithium and lanthanum and tritium, that would not be present in the amounts and with the correlations between them unless this had been a nuclear event. In other words, the Twin Towers appear to have been taken out by a sophisticated arrangement of mini nukes. I was struck the day of the attack just watching those buildings blow apart because it was obvious to me, although I'm not an engineer, that was preposterous. And in fact, we all know no steel structure high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire in the history of structural engineering. I mean, it's simply absurd. And when the government claimed these were collapses, they were obviously not collapses. You had a bona fide collapse with Building 7, which came down at 5:20 in the afternoon, over 7 hours after the Twin Towers were destroyed, in a classic controlled demolition. All the floors came down at the same time, characteristic kink at the top, about the speed of free fall. And there was a pile of debris equal to 12% of the height of the original 47th floor, so you had 5.5 floors. Well, with the Twin Towers, it's completely different. They're blowing apart in every direction from the top down. All the floors remain stationary. The building's being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. And believe it or not, when it's over, there's nothing there. If they were destroyed to ground level or even below, Father Frank Morales from St. Mark's Episcopal Church, who was a first responder, was twice on my own radio shows and twice explained that to be the case, which is confirmed by photographic evidence. So we had something going on very, very different than we have been told. And where, this was a fairly elaborate case. The whole story about the 19 Islamic terrorists commandeering the planes was an absurdity. Even Osama denied he had anything to do with it when he was told about it. He said that this was, there appeared to be a government within the government that wanted to blame this on Muslims. And he was, of course, exactly right. No less an authority than William Jefferson Clinton. Bill Clinton said there was a government within the government and that he did not control it. But the whole idea was to blame it on Muslims to justify a new enemy, namely this sometimes called clash of civilization, when there was no justification for it whatsoever, but where Israel wanted to engage the United States in wars in the Middle East to take out the modern sophisticated Arab states that served as a counterbalance to its domination of the Middle East, and where Israel exercises a disproportionate influence on the American Congress, sad to say. Now, when you come to ISIS, this appears to be a very peculiar development where Senator John McCain appears to have played a very important role, but where it's sponsored by the United States, by Israel and Saudi Arabia. We have 2 American generals who are advising ISIS. We have airdrops from American planes with food, ammunition, and weapons. It is another specter in the Middle East, part theater, part not. I mean, those beheadings to which you alluded were fake. I mean, I've yet to see a beheading video that had any authenticity to it. However, the immolation of this Jordanian pilot, which I just watched this morning in a remarkable, approximately half an hour long documentary produced with higher standards than we normally get from ABC, CBS, or NBC. I mean, a really expensive production. It's pretty clear to me watching that event that he was indeed burned to death in that cage-like structure and is surrounded by members of ISIS. But the whole thing is, very much political theater. And I do think ISIS has to be wiped out, but it's very odd because you got the U.S., for example, playing both sides, for ISIS and against it.
It's almost like a convenient problem in a way, isn't it? It's, it seems that a lot of these conspiracies like 9/11, they're even not too fussed about covering their tracks as long as they don't get found out at the time. If people talk about it 10 years later, then it's almost like you can't do anything about it anyway. So they're always just trying to confuse people and make a bit of a mess of it at the time. But I think nowadays people are so on it with the internet, with the Charles with that going on in Paris, I mean that's nice and fresh and stuff. And already, I mean, sometimes the only thing is what I find is sometimes is because there are conspiracies. You also find that some people, they'll just grab anything that happens, they'll grab it. Is there anything that's happened out there recently that you think, well, hang on, perhaps this is actually genuine? This isn't a conspiracy, guys. And but any particular
the interesting events are the ones that are so prominent. I mean, that make a difference to the course of history, like the 7/7 London subway bombings. That was a very clear case of a government-conducted operation using a private firm where the lads who were supposed to be responsible weren't even present at the subway stops because they missed the train from Luton. I have a friend in the UK, Nick Collerstrom, who's the leading expert on 7/7. He's published a book, Terror on the Tube, now in its 3rd edition. I just featured him on my new radio show, which has video capability, called The Real Deal on MBC, Media Broadcast Center, where you can find it online. And Maud Dibb, John Hill, actually did a brilliant 1-hour presentation from beginning to end for the whole thing. Clearly a fabrication, unbelievably obvious. When the young men discovered what had happened, they headed for Canary Wharf because that was where the international news services were located, including Reuters. But the London police closed down the area and shot them dead. I mean, we have lots of patsies here. They were patsies for 7/7, just as Lee Oswald was a patsy for JFK and Sirhan Sirhan for Bobby. In fact, most Americans, or really most of the world, is unaware Bobby was shot 4 times from behind. The fatal shot entered from an inch and a half behind his right ear. Sirhan was only in front of him and never got closer than about a yard to Bobby. So, I mean, he didn't fire the shots that killed him. They were fired from behind. And when the world-famous medical examiner, Thomas Noguchi, gave his very thorough, painstaking report showing the scenario I've just described, believe it or not, the power of the police department with which his report was discrepant had so much influence that he was fired. I mean, it's ridiculous. Any investigation of a criminal case has to begin with a medical examiner, which is why in the case of JFK, it was so important they steal the body get it off to Bethesda, where they actually altered the body in the route they took him to Walter Reed, where the best forensic pathologists in the military removed slugs because it wouldn't do to find there were two different calibers. The shooters were using, their own preferred weapons. But it's really got a lot to do with the domination of the media. There was a time when we had thousands of independent newspapers, radio stations, television, and so forth here in the United States. Today, they are all owned by 6 major corporations with close ties to the American government. And where even William Colby, a former director, said that the CIA owns everyone of significance in the major media, which was echoing a result of Carl Bernstein, who published an article in 1977 in Rolling Stone entitled "The CIA and the Media," where he was reporting that officials of the agency were boasting that their greatest successes had been with Time Life, with CBS, and with the New York Times. I say today there's more truth in Pravda or on Press TV than you can get from the New York Times or ABC. I mean, it's embarrassing. The American media has been completely co-opted, completely corrupted. It's run by the Central Intelligence Agency.
Okay, well, David, over to you, mate.
Well, James is a very impressive man indeed. I mean, I'm thinking at the moment of his background in the philosophy of science, probability, cognitive science, artificial intelligence. So to have someone as eminent as this speaking about conspiracies, I find quite mind-blowing, to be honest. It was bringing to mind that awful movie, what was it, on the American Sniper recently? Man that we really should not look up to. I find the mixed moral reactions to that incredible. James, I mean, when did you first start thinking that the world is not what it seems to be? I was speaking to Klaus Donner the other day. With him, it was sort of a slow revelation. He'd get artifact after artifact after artifact, and he'd think, no, it can't be the case. No, it can't be the case. No, it can't be the case. Until it eventually reached critical mass. And then he thought, no, it's simply, we're not being shown history as it is. What was that point of revelation with you?
Well, I think it was in the aftermath of Oliver Stone's brilliant film JFK, where Oliver didn't know the Zapruder film had been altered. He didn't realize there were shooters at 6 different locations. He posited 3. And he didn't know the biggest secret of JFK research, namely that Lee Oswald was actually captured in a very famous photograph in the doorway of the book depository as the shooting was taking place. And therefore, not only cannot be the lone demented gunman, cannot have even been one of the assassins. But the film by Oliver Stone, which in my opinion is the most accurate, complete, and comprehensive presentation of what actually happened on 22 November 1963 in Dealey Plaza ever presented to the American public through the mass media, was a subject of unbelievable criticism, attacks, vicious even before the film had been out. And it was at a certain point, actually, it was in late 1992, when my wife said, "You're not going to believe this," flipped on the TV, and there I watched a rather distinguished-looking fellow standing behind a lectern with the logo of the American Medical Association, who was denouncing the film, and every significant student of the case, Mark Lane, David Lifton, Robert Groden, a host of others, calling the film docufiction, assailing Charles Crenshaw, who had actually been present in trauma room number 1, where he was the last physician to observe the body. He closed JFK's eyes before the body was wrapped in sheets and put into the bronze ceremonial casket, and then 2 days later was responsible for the treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Oswald. When I saw this editor, where I had already had a great deal of editorial experience, I served 10 years as an associate editor of Synthèse, a very prominent international journal for epistemology, methodology, and the philosophy of science. I would found an international journal, Minds and Machines, for philosophy, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science, which I would edit for 10 years on my own. I mean, it was just, to me, obvious this guy was abusing the journal of the AMA for political purposes. And it struck me then that if a person of this degree of status should be abusing his position, perhaps some of us with special background and abilities ought to become involved in doing this in a case like this to get it straight. And I discovered a letter to the editor written by a member of the AMA who had subsequently resigned from the organization, David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, who's the world's leading expert today on the medical evidence. And I wrote to him then and said, why don't we collaborate on a long article or a book, with which he agreed, and soon several others wanted to join us. And I put together just an astounding group of experts to study the case. But from that point on, I realized how massively the media was controlled and how deep some of this corruption ran. And it's just took a hold of me, so that in my retirement since 2006, I've been doing, nothing but. And it's, I mean, just to give you an illustration of it, I've had 5 different radio shows before my current, which is only recent, where I had video capability. But on the Real Deal on Revere Radio, I had 880 two-hour interviews on complex and controversial issues like these, including Fukushima and a host of other issues related thereto. And I've now become, a journalist for Veterans Today. I published probably 100 articles, and I do, I've done over 1,000 interviews on all these subjects, and it's just it burns in me. Disgust with the government that it lies and deceives the American people to manipulate us for political purposes, and I'm doing my best to expose the falsehoods and reveal the truths, so that Americans can understand their own history.
Oh, that's incredibly well said. I mean, let me throw something at you, James. I mean, I'm skeptical of lots of conspiracy theories. I mean, the David Icks and the Rusties of the world. I mean, all these blasted lizards and that sort of stuff. I mean, I can see, sadly, a conspiracy taking part amongst the banking elite. I think one has to have one's eyes closed not to see that. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Morgan Stanleys and all that. What do you think is fueling all of these conspiracies? Is it simply politics, or is it economics? And how far does it go? I mean, I'm assuming you don't see a metaphysical level to this, or do you?
Well, you got to look at it from their point of view. What they're doing is simply manipulating events to benefit themselves, maximize their profit margin. And if that involves killing 3,000 Americans to promote a war in the Middle East, is going to make phenomenal profits for Halliburton and other American countries. If they're going to be able to exploit the mineral wealth of Afghanistan, which has vast iron and other metal deposits, but most importantly, the world's largest deposit of lithium, comparable only to one in Bolivia, where lithium is used in triggers for nuclear weapons, components in computers, and for electric car batteries. They're going to be ruthless about it. I mean, look at this assailing Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was a benevolent dictator. Even Aristotle recommended that as the most beneficial to the citizens, because if he's benevolent, the problem is most dictators are not benevolent, but Gaddafi was. He shared the wealth of Libya with the people. He gave $25,000 gifts to newly married couples. He had a national health care program, national system of public education. He was developing the greatest engineering project of modern times, or the Great Waterworks project that would have turned northern Africa into an oasis. And the gold dinar, which was a currency of real value, unlike what we get from our printing press with the Fed, whose only value has been for its use in transactions involving oil, which is why countries that have abandoned the petrodollar, Libya had, Iraq did, Iran has become, fall into the sights of the American government. I mean, it's got nothing to do with democracy or freedom. The first act of the rebel group in Libya was to found a new central bank. And I said to myself, well, things are obviously not as they're supposed to be. In fact, believe it or not, the United Nations was about to recognize him with a humanitarian award, Muammar Gaddafi, while NATO was being used to destroy the country. It's disgusting. I mean, in each of these cases, take Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Iraq is an ancient civilization. They had a reliable infrastructure, reliable water, electricity. They had a national health care, public education. They had antiquities and artifacts dating back thousands of years. And we went in and just destroyed it. We made a total mess. Iraq was a country like Yugoslavia that required a strong hand to subdue and control the factions that were historic, virtually genetic, between the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds, for example. But Saddam managed to do it. And while he did commit brutal acts, by and large, the quality of life in Iraq under Saddam was overwhelmingly better than it is today in the aftermath of our intervention. We have committed one atrocity after another in the Middle East, and it was all done by fabricating the events of 9/11. It's just shameful and utterly irresponsible. And it even brings us eventually around to ISIS as one more way to try to, manage public opinion about what's going on in the Middle East.
Extraordinary. Let me tell you a suspicion of mine, James. I think you're uniquely qualified to answer. Do you think a lot of the elite thinking, if elite isn't too crass a term, is fueled by technological advance? I mean, do they think they can escape Madame de Guillotine these days and a new French Revolution because they've got the mistaken belief that technology will protect them? What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think it works the other way around, David. They're using technology to benefit their control by, for example, the massive NSA surveillance. This has nothing to do with domestic terror. They're surveilling every American's email, our financial records, our medical records, our phone calls. And it's done in the name of domestic terrorism. But a report issued by the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, 3 October 2012, based upon its review of 860 fusion center reports for fusion centers merge federal, state, and local anti-terrorist activity, found in all of those reports gathered between 2009 and 2010, not a single instance of domestic terrorist activity. None. Zilch. Zero. Nada. They didn't even find where the fusion centers had disrupted or caused, interfered with the commission of a terrorist act. What that means is when you have such a broad sample, it was 680 rather than 860. That's a very reasonable statistical sample to base for the inference that domestic terrorist activity in the United States is virtually non-existent. Therefore, the justification for this massive surveillance cannot possibly be to control domestic terrorism. In fact, when it was first introduced, which actually was in February of 2001, 7 months or more before 9/11, Admiral Poindexter referred to it as total information awareness. That was so Orwellian to change the name to terrorist information awareness. But while the claim has been made it was justified by 9/11, it was put into place long before 9/11. And they use this technology. They're trying to track veterans, constitutionalists, Ron Paul supporters, 9/11 truthers, NRA members, anyone who might have the background or ability to stand up to resist the imposition of a military police state here in the U.S., which is nevertheless proceeding apace, and where it's aided and abetted by fabricated events like Sandy Hook. We have even found the FEMA manual for Sandy Hook, where they had a rehearsal on the 13th, went live on the 14th, which explains a host of anomalies. We had the sign, a portable sign, saying everyone must check in. Well, if you look at the manual, it says on the 13th, everyone must check in. We had porta potties there. We've got this fellow, Wolfgang Halbig, former Florida State Trooper, national school safety expert, try to find out who delivered the porta potties. I mean, how ridiculous. They won't even give him that information because they were there on the 13th, not the 14th. We have Adam Lanza, the alleged shooter's date of death in the Social Security Death Index, the 13th, not the 14th. We had donation sites set up the 13th, not the 14th. People just didn't realize there were two different dates involved. Well, once you read the manual, you see exactly what was going on here. Complete scam. Nobody died. No children. There was the school actually was closed in 2008. There was no evacuation because there were no students there to evacuate. There is a celebrated photograph that was sent all over the world with a string of about 15 children being led up by a police officer, taken by the Newtown Bee photographer Shannon Hicks. But she took a second photograph from further back. And what you don't see in her photograph is there's a whole set of parents standing there with their arms crossed, watching while this is taking place, and where the policewoman is reorganizing the children in the line to get a better shot. It's that bad. In fact, we have a school safety expert from Los Angeles, Paul Preston, who gave an interview with Sophia Smallstorm, which I have published also on Veterans Today, where I have now over 35 articles about Sandy Hook. I'm just dumbfounded that I should have published so much on Sandy Hook, where he was so disturbed by what he saw that he contacted the people he knew in the Obama Department of Education, who confirmed to him it had been a drill, no one had died, and it was done to promote a gun control agenda.
Absolutely fascinating. Do I detect an interest in Zionism running through your work? I made the mistake a couple of years ago, which I don't repent for, of speaking against Zionism. I find Zionism racist. And to be anti-Zionist doesn't mean anti-Semitic, of course, which the British need to grow up about. Do you think there is an untoward Zionist influence in American politics?
No question about it. Absolutely, without any doubt, that is correct. I gotta say, until relatively recently, the concept of Zionism wasn't really even in my vocabulary. But the first political speech I ever gave, which was in 2008 at a Ron Paul Freedom Rally in Washington, D.C., on the grass outside of the Capitol on 15 April, which is Income Tax Day, I was explaining what would be subsequently published in an article entitled 9/11 and the Neocon Agenda, how having individuals with dual citizenship, joint U.S.-Israeli, for example, in decision-making or policy-shaping positions was a huge mistake. Because how could you possibly know that their loyalty to the other state did not outweigh their loyalty to the United States? I called for their removal from office. Of course, we have so many key players who are joint U.S.-Israeli citizens. I mean, Michael Chertoff, for example, was the assistant to then Attorney General John Ashcroft. After the dancing Israelis, these 5 Israelis who appear to have been Mossad agents were observed in Liberty State Park filming and rejoicing as the Twin Towers were being destroyed. They were subsequently arrested in an urban moving systems van. They said that the driver said to the arresting officer, we are not the problem. Your problem is our problem. The problem is the Palestinians. The vehicle was, had explosive residue, passports, lots of money, box cutters. There were other urban moving system vans that were apprehended that day. We now know, in fact, the plan was much more elaborate than was actually carried out. They were going to take out the George Washington Bridge, the Holland Tunnel, and the other tunnel whose name slips me momentarily. I mean, there was going to be, isolating Manhattan. It was going to be quite elaborate. Gordon Duff, who has excellent intel defense connections and who is the senior editor of Veterans Today, has recently published about it, entitled about documenting 9/11, the Fort Lee mystery, because it turns out there's a Jewish center for international studies located in Fort Lee, New Jersey, that appears to have been where a whole lot, if not all, of the local planning for what would take place on 9/11 was being done.
Absolutely intriguing. To make sure you and I are firmly on MI5 and MI6's list, I'm sure we've made that honor already anyway.
Yes.
Let me throw something at you, James. A couple of years ago, had a friend, excuse me, owning a loose association, really, a loose associate, who had been present at the Princess Diana car crash. He said to me in confidence, well, he was there. And of course, it can't all be put down to delusion. He remembers her getting out the car and walking around, and then an ambulance coming, and all of a sudden she's dead.
Yes.
Have you looked into that conspiracy?
Yes.
And is it tied in with American manipulation of British media coverage? Let me put it
Well,
that.
I think this had more to do with the royal family being upset at the idea that she might marry a Muslim. The armaments were upset because she was having a campaign that was very successful against landmines. You're absolutely right. On a 1 to 10 scale for seriousness of harm to the individual, she rated between a 1 and a 2 after the accident. She survived the accident. She was taken in the ambulance, which was there at the scene for nearly an hour, and then another 45 minutes to get to a hospital that was only about 10 minutes away. And they stopped about 5 blocks where the ambulance was observed swinging back and forth. They were beating her to death in the ambulance to ensure she had sufficient internal injuries that she could not survive. And indeed, within 10 minutes after they got her to the hospital, she was dead. I'm interviewing the leading expert on Diana on Monday on my show, as a matter of fact.
Let me just throw one last thing at you before Paul beats me to death about hogging the interview. I normally find our interviews, when it comes to our discussions, our talks, when it comes to conspiracies, a little bewildering. You have me absolutely fixated. Where's all this corruption coming from? Why have we always been this bad, or do you think it's something about modern times?
Well, I really think, your allusion to technology had to do with it. I think the creation of the state of Israel, which is an apartheid state, had a lot to do with it. I think that Israel is seeking to exercise influence all over the world. I have no doubt it was behind the Charlie Hebdo, which was such an obvious false flag. There was even an X on the ground where the vehicle was to park so it would be properly featured for the surveillance camera. When they shot the officer on the ground, his head didn't explode. There was no blood on the ground. In fact, we have a reporter who said she was there when the police came over and laid down the blood. Charlie Hebdo only met once a week, so they had to have information about when they were supposed to be there. Going out and calling Allah Akbar is a little too theatrical. Having an identity, having an ID card found is reminiscent of the passport that survived the destruction of the Twin Towers. So you got two massive 500,000-ton steel and concrete buildings that are blown into very fine dust, but a passport survives? I mean, this is absurd beyond belief. And then you get the fertile imagination of Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to make a point that this grocery store is kosher, right? The Americans are so dumb. He's got to point out it's kosher. It's like he's going to the United Nations and he has to give this cartoon drawing of a bomb with a fuse on it showing how close Iran is to developing a nuclear weapon, which is completely absurd and contradicted by our own 16 intelligence agencies, which concluded in 2007 that Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons, a conclusion it reaffirmed in 2011. And yet we have this absurd preoccupation with Iran, whose national policy is nuclear energy for all, nuclear weapons for none, on the basis of nothing. There's no justification for it whatsoever. And yet Netanyahu, who in my opinion has earned the title of the Chicken Little of the Middle East, keeps complaining that the sky is falling, the nuclear bombs are going to fall. It's ridiculous.
You have got to come back on this show, James. We had a wonderful rematch with Marcus Allen on the theatre of politics. I think you and I have a long conversation ahead of us on that.
I would be very pleased to do that. The other tunnel, of course, was the Lincoln Tunnel. So they were going to blow the George Washington Bridge, the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel. And subsequently, when I was and others at a Chandler 9/11 Truth Conference were being attacked for being anti-Semitic, I would publish an article entitled, "Is 9/11 Research Anti-Semitic?" I mean, just as you were observing before, criticism of the actions and policies of the government of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism involves discounting the value or worth of an individual or their opinions on the basis of their ethnic origin or religious orientation. I do none of the latter. I do a great deal of the former, just as you described. I'm not remotely anti-Semitic, but I am vehemently anti-Zionist, which combines the twin beliefs in Jewish superiority with a dubious historical entitlement to all the lands of the Middle East from the Tigris Euphrates to the Nile. I reject that categorically.
James, you are restoring my faith in human nature this evening. Paul, I've kept you out for too long.
One of the things I want to touch on a bit more is the actual false flags. As you say, it's staged and set up. Why do you think they'd do that? Why wouldn't they just? I mean, they've obviously these agendas they don't mind killing people, unfortunately.
Well, when you have control of the media, you can stage an event and it serves the same purpose, and you don't actually have to kill anybody. I mean, one of my recent articles is entitled "Rejoice for Christmas. No one died at Sandy Hook or at the Boston bombing." I'll tell you how bad it is with the Boston bombing, which was created to subvert the Fourth Amendment and to undermine a statute from 1878 called Posse Comitatus that precludes using the military to perform police functions. We have a video where you can hear police on the bullhorn calling out, This is a drill. This is a drill. We have tweets from the Boston Globe, a major newspaper, saying a demolition bomb is going to be set off during the marathon for the benefit of police squad activities, and a second one saying it's going to be set off in 1 minute in front of the library. And lo and behold, 1 minute later, it's set off in front of the Boston Public Library. We have footage there that shows, although the victims are supposed to have lost their body parts, there's no blood present. The blood only shows up on a delayed basis, and it's Hollywood blood. It came out of a tube. Human blood turns dark red. This Hollywood blood stays bright reddish orange. We even have the tubes from which the blood came in the debris afterwards. I have published about this, Charlie Hebdo, Sandy Hook, and the Boston bombing, all three, in a recent article of mine entitled Media Complicit and Indispensable for False Flag Success, which I would say, for those who want a short course in how all these things are done, check out that one specific article for an introduction.
Interesting. I wanted to bring up David Shaler. He's an ex-MI5 or Secret Services. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've met David. Yeah. I've been to London about 7 times, and I met David at a meeting of their 9/11 Truth Group. As the founder of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, I organized our first national conference in Madison in 2007, but our first international conference in London in 2010, and met David Shaler on that occasion. And in fact, on this past Monday's program, I featured the brilliant film by Maud Dibb, a.k.a. John Hill, entitled 7/7 Ripple Effect. And for the second hour, a conversation of Nick Kollerstrom with David Shaler, talking about, the absurdities, including the fact that the train from Luton had been canceled so that these young men weren't able to even be at the tube stops at the time they were going to be blamed for blowing the subway trains. I mean, it gets so absurd, it's unbelievable. But David Shaler seems to me to be a good guy. That's my take on him.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't actually personally met him. I remember seeing him originally on Sky News talking about 9/11 and talking about a lot of the stuff that you go into. And then he kind of went through this phase where he's like got a spiritual, claiming to be God, the Son of God, and all this and that. And I kind of thought to myself, I was a bit suspicious, because I thought, is he an MI5 guy? And he's come out with all this information, and then suddenly swung so that people can make him out to be crazy.
They're performing a lot of mind control operations. They have all kinds of techniques to do it, and they can make anyone look like a blooming lunatic, anytime they want. So if you get somebody who's making a powerful impression and they want to discredit him, they'll find a way to do it. I mean, I just think you have to take that as part and parcel of what's going on. And you have to be able to sort out, that they can be performing these attacks on individual researchers just as they can on events like 7/7, Sandy Hook, Charlie Hebdo, Boston bombing, and all that, to fool a larger crowd. But they will go out of their way to try to discredit those who are doing the best research.
You promise you're not going to go craziness then?
I hope not. My wife already tells me she thinks I'm a nut.
Well, the thing is, I think the thing is, that stuff, as you say, that stuff is real. I think people don't realize how real brainwashing is. It's out there. What was the guy that the cinema shootings in America?
Yeah.
I can't remember with the
Lots
name.
Lots of questions about that. There are others who are better versed in those. The Aurora shooting, the Batman shooting, and even Tucson looks suspicious because there isn't blood where it should be at those times. It looks as though the judge was the real target of that because he was going to be handling a case and someone didn't want him to do it. It's like Charles Harrelson, who was the tallest of the 3 tramps who were escorted through Dealey Plaza that were suspected of being shooters. They were actually fallback patsies if Lee Oswald hadn't worked out. Where Harrelson was eventually convicted of assassinating a judge with a high-powered rifle, Judge Maximum Woods, where a drug dealer was going to be sentenced, and he didn't want Woods to do it, so he had Harrelson take him out. But I mean, these things happen. I mean, it's a really complicated, messy business, and I think David put his finger on something. I mean, I did all this. I've done all this complex issues in philosophy, on the philosophy of science, the nature of mind, cognitive science, a host of issues, but since my retirement, I felt, applying myself to try to clear up all these deceits and deceptions perpetrated by the government would be a good way to contribute whatever I have left to contribute, because I've done so much already in philosophy. I mean, today I have 29 books, two dozen of which are academic, then three on JFK, one on Wellstone, one on 9/11. I hope to contribute to that because, I'm really not done in my pursuit of exposing falsehoods and revealing truths.
I think that's definitely a good thing. Touching on the Batman, the cinema shootings with the Batman movie, there's something strange about that Batman connection, because I think I've seen during one of the Batman movies, he's writing on a scrap of paper and you see Sandy Hook written down. And then, of course, on the most recent Batman movie, you actually see the bad guy that they're projecting as this image of fear to the people turns out to be some actor who just wants to smoke some weed and so they kind of make a joke out of it. But I often think, it's very interesting when you see that in films, and it's almost like it's someone trying to tell us something here,
Well, let me take us to a far more serious case in Buenos Aires, where, the Israeli embassy was attacked in 1992. And the Israelis claimed it had been a car bomb and that Iran had done it, but the embassy blew up from the inside out. Now, they only killed about 24 people, so they came back to do it again. And in 1994, they blew up the Jewish Community Center and killed about 84, rather more spectacular. Now, it was been thoroughly investigated. I published about it with Adrian Salbucci in VoltaireNet.org, an article entitled False Flag Attacks in Argentina, 1992-1994. But they're very upset with Cristina Kirchner because she is not a supporter of Zionism. She's critical of Israel, as every intelligent political leader in the world ought to be if they understand what's going on in the world. So they created a situation where there was a special prosecutor who allegedly committed suicide on the eve of his presenting a 350-page dossier that was supposed to demonstrate she'd been concealing that Iran really was behind it. Iran had nothing to do with it whatsoever. There is no doubt about it. And now, in relation to the death of this prosecutor, they're claiming to have found in his garbage a warrant that he had drafted for the arrest of President Kirchner. This is so absurd, I can't begin to tell you. The CIA fabricates documents, forges these instruments all the time. That's what happened to Joe Wilson, who actually went to investigate the claim that Saddam Hussein was seeking to obtain yellow cake for nuclear weapons from Libya. He found these were forged documents. They had the signature of Italian officials who were no longer in office when they were signed. And Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby were so upset with that they outed his wife, Valerie Plame, who had the deepest and most important CIA covert operation to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. They outed her out of spite. Now, if you had a person who was dedicated to the interests of the nation, the last thing you would do would be out the CIA agent responsible for this entire network. It led to the death of dozens of people, destroyed the network, and it ceased having a responsible intelligence operation to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This is a forged document in Argentina. Anyone really is well-versed in this will recognize it. I published an article about what's going on there prior to this document showing up, entitled Cristina of Argentina, Target of Israeli False Flag Attack. That's one, too, that's worth your audience checking out.
Cool. Yeah, no, definitely. David, we're sort of creeping towards the end now, so is there anything you'd like to chip in with?
Oh, I mean, James is making me feel lazy. I'm only up to book 4. Let me finish with one last salvo. The Patriot Act. How did this abomination actually get passed?
That's great, because, you see, the purpose of 9/11 was not only to reverse American foreign policy, where at least officially had been that we never attacked any nation that hadn't attacked us first, by falsely alleging that, Afghanistan and Iraq were involved and all that. Really, it was a complete reversal of U.S. foreign policy, where we now became the aggressor nation, and where together with Israel, we are the greatest aggressor nation in the world, and where, in addition, it was to facilitate the passage of the Patriot Act, which is a massive document that had obviously been on the shelf a long time, just waiting the right opportunity, when two members of the Senate, Patrick Leahy, the head of the Judiciary Committee, and Tom Daschle, who was the majority leader in the Senate, wanted to hold hearings on the Patriot Act. They were subjected to the anthrax attack, which actually killed postal workers. So the idea was, if you didn't get this passed, your life might be next. It was a obscenity. It's been used for all kinds of bad purposes. The Patriot Act ought to be rescinded. Even James Sensenberger, who's a Republican congressman from the state of Wisconsin, where I reside, has admitted that it's being used in all kinds of improper ways that were never intended by the authors of the document. But that's the way it goes. I mean, Dick Cheney was the most malevolent figure to ever hold high office in the United States. The effects of his influence are going to reverberate for decades, sad to say. 9/11 is a completely staged event done completely different way than we've been told. We have a massive amount of research on it. I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December of 2005. I maintain its website, 911scholars.org. You can learn the product of our second international conference event in Vancouver at the www.911vancouverhearings.org, which has a lot of current information about it. But the most recent is all found on Veterans Today, where I continue to publish today.
James, I could talk to you for hours, but we're approaching that time. Paul, that's me done for the evening.
Okay, well, it's been great having you on, James. Very interesting, lots and lots of subjects to cover.
Yeah.
I think maybe it'd be great if you could come on next time and we'll just focus on one particular conspiracy that we can really dig deep in and hear about all your research, because there is so much stuff out there, and it's nice to sort of check different ones out and look deeper into them.
Well, it's been my great pleasure. I'd be glad to come back anytime. I thank you both. It's been terrific talking with you.
Is there anything you'd like to let our listeners know about your work, or any things you've got coming up?
Well, they might want to check out this new show I have, which is a video on Media Broadcast Center, NBC, The Real Deal, because I've been featuring, really hard-hitting programs on major issues, even including the Holocaust, may I say, which most of the world is unwilling to touch. But where Nick Kollerstrom, the same person who's the expert on 7/7, has published a new book entitled Breaking the Spell, where, based upon scientific research based on the laws of biochemistry and of materials science, he and others have been able to prove that key elements of the Holocaust narrative cannot possibly be true, including that Zyklon B was used to gas millions of Jews. Their bodies would have turned bright pink. We have no reports of pink bodies. The walls of the gas chambers, because of causal interaction, would have turned blue. The only chambers whose walls turned blue, however, were used for delousing. This all had to do with the Allies trying to deflect attention from their massive bombing of German cities. That was an act of collective punishment, which ironically the Nuremberg Tribunal would declare to be a war crime. If anyone were to read just one article, too, by the way, about this era, try Robert Faurisson, Against Revisionism, Hollywoodism, and you'll begin to understand what was really going on during this epoch in time.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's controversial stuff, but stuff that's definitely out there and worth covering. So yeah, it's stuff people got to check out.
That's all I do is complex and controversial. Yeah. If it's not controversial, it's not worth talking about. And if it's not complex, everyone's sorted it out already.
Well, us on the show, we want to cover everything, whether we believe it or not. And if there's someone that's got something they want to say and they've done their research, we're happy to have people on, so it's all good.
Well, my article on that, just for a final footnote then, is entitled The Holocaust Narrative, Politics Trumps Science, also on Veterans Today.
Excellent. Okay, thanks again, and we'll be speaking with you soon, hopefully.
Super. My great pleasure. Thank you very much.
That was John Fetzer. Some stuff there to get stuck into, David? Lots of stuff to think about.
Deeply impressed. I wasn't expecting such a rational, vivacious man. I mean, he's passionate about freedom and truth. He's got a huge knowledge of these things. I'm deeply impressed. I'm won over, Paul.
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think because there's so much conspiracies out there, it's when you do actually see one and you can see how it's possible for the conspiracy to actually be a reality, then it opens the floodgates, and then some people then just go, oh, everything's a conspiracy. And sometimes that can work against you, because if you're convinced that something's very true and then it gets debunked, not only does it do your head in a little bit, but it also makes everyone else doubt it, because they think, well, everyone believed that was real and look how that turned out. That was a load of rubbish. It's been debunked. So then they want to wash the baby out with the baby water, with the dirty water. So it's you've got to be careful, I think. But there is certainly a lot of conspiracies out there, and I think people like James do a good job.
Look, you're the conspiracy boy, not me. And as I say, I do think there's a conspiracy of demons behind the banking industry. But, if someone like James comes along and says, look, there are wider conspiracies, I'm not saying I believe them. I am saying I'm keeping the door open and want to hear more. Yeah, no,
that's kind of my philosophy, and it always... Don't believe anything, but keep your mind open. I think that's I like that in a way.
Free thoughts and open minds. What we founded at the very beginning of these shows, and what I hope we're keeping true to.
You love saying that, don't you?
I do. You're quite right.
Okay, well, coming up on the show, we've got Douglas Myrick to talk about his novenetic system, which is like a law of attraction, way of controlling your own mind and creating your own universe and your own life. So that's a really interesting, positive subject. We've also got the return of Thad McCracken to Chaos Magic, and him talking to us about his new book, which should be very interesting. And we've also got Brenton Sowen coming on, who's going to talk to us about his claims of seeing beings from Hollow Earth. So that one's going to be very off the wall, and I'm sure very interesting.
Well, I love Hollow Earth stuff. Actually, I think he says he met some beings from the Hollow Earth, so it's not quite as ethereal as that. He's rubbing shoulders with them or something. Absolutely amazing.
Yes, it sounds like another one to check out. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Don't forget to throw us over a donation if you can. Tell your friends about the show, link it, and most of all, make sure you tune in next time. See you later.
Chowsy, chowsy.